I want to welcome you all tonight to the next installment of the Paterson Museum Foundation's webinar series. The Paterson Museum Foundation is a nonprofit organization that was created several years ago to support the museum. And one of the things that we do is provide this webinar series, but we also are involved in helping the museum acquire new artifacts, preserve artifacts, some cases, literally cases, provide display cases for the museum, a whole bunch of different things to sort of help the museum continue its function, of course, is for educational purposes. And so we're so happy that this became part of it. And of course, as most of you know, the pandemic sort of created a need for things like this. So it's turned out to be a wonderful asset to us. Just so you know, when this program is concluded tonight, within a few days, it'll be posted up onto the Paterson Museum's Foundation's, the Paterson Museum's YouTube page. So you'll be able to watch it, send a link to your friends or what have you if you want to watch it again. It will be available there. And there's a bunch of other ones there already that you might, if you haven't seen them before, you might be interested. So I just want to point that out to you. Since we are a nonprofit, we do, of course, hope for donations. And if you feel so inclined tonight or whenever to do that, Dave has just posted a link in the chat box for donations through PayPal to our organization. So if you'd like to do that, take a look at our chat box. If you have questions for this program, we'll answer them at the end. And you can type those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we'll answer whatever questions you might have at the end of the program. So without further ado, let me get started. I'm your MC and your presenter tonight. So my name is Glenn Corbett. I am the president of the Paterson Museum Foundation. I've been interested in Paterson history for quite a while, like many of you. My normal day job is I'm an associate professor over at John Jay College in New York, where I teach fire science and public management. So, but this is a fun thing to do, these kind of lectures, and for all of us studying Paterson history. So, so tonight we're going to be dealing with a man by the name of Roswell Colt. Now, of course, everyone I'm sure is familiar with Samuel Colt and perhaps his role in Paterson and the gun and what have you. But we're going to talk about another family member by the name of Roswell Colt. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we can get started. Let's see, 1 second here. Let me move this bar away so I can. Okay, now I can do slideshow. Beginning. Okay. So we're going to talk about this guy here, Roswell. He is perhaps, and you'll see a quote I'm going to give you here in a second, a wonderful quote, perhaps the most important person in Paterson's history for the 19th century. We don't know a heck of a lot about, well, we haven't known a heck of a lot about him. And so my odyssey of sort of looking into the life of this individual has led me on this incredible journey. It's my hope one day to actually do the biography of Roswell Lyman Colt. And so I'm going to take you through things that I've discovered over the years about him and kind of put together a picture for you so you understand why he was integral in the development of Paterson, particularly in the early to mid 19th century. Paterson owes its powerhouse status as an industrial center really to him to a great extent. Today we'll talk about the research that was involved, finding out about him. It's important to note that there are no books written about Roswell. There are, excuse me, there are articles, scholarly journal articles, mentions in a variety of books, but there is no definitive biography of him, and that's what I'm hoping to do. And one of the things about that is the fact that when you don't have a biography to work from, you don't have a roadmap. And so my process of, again, trying to learn about Roswell really involves setting up a sort of geographical and biographical timeline. And I was able to do that through the remaining documents that exists from him in various entities. We'll talk about them in a minute as well. But it's sort of, and you saw in the earlier slide, I had a picture of a jigsaw puzzle, and to some extent, this is a gigantic jigsaw puzzle in which you don't know how many pieces there are. So that's the element of this. I've been working on this for over a decade now, and an inch closer to getting this biography put together. But I want to take you again along my journey here so we can learn about him and really understand and appreciate the things that he did for the city of Paterson. And we'll go through various points of his life, some high points, but also some very low points in his life, and we'll discuss those. This is perhaps I'm probably going to lead with this in the biography. I think it would be a great statement at the very front end of the book, and you'll appreciate this. Let me just read it. So I'm not going to read you anything else other than this tonight, but this was a New York Times a letter to the editor of the New York Times back in 1907 when they were going to install the Hamilton statue in the city. And so this individual who's from there's a misspelling in this. It's the Boudinot family, not Boudinot, but Boudinot family, wrote this letter. And so let me read it to you. It says, a statue of Alexander Hamilton, which is to be erected in the city, is on its way from Italy, and its coming has stirred up some feelings. Many persons versed in the history of the city consider Hamilton was the founder of the city, but it is asserted by others that he was only the paid counsel of the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufactures, WBS, and it's Boudinot, a descendant of one of the original settlers, said in the course of an interview. Actually, I'm sorry, it was an interview, it wasn't a letter. Interview. It certainly does strike me as an anomalous that Paterson should erect a statue to Alexander Hamilton, for he never had any interest in the founding of the city. He was nothing more than a paid employee. He did certain work for which he was paid, just as any other lawyer would have been, and he evidently did not think, judging by his letters, that he was entitled to any credit for the slight part that he took in the connection with the founding of the city. If the people are so anxious to erect a statue commemorative to a man who really did do a great deal for Paterson, they ought to erect a statue to Roswell Colt. So now, who's the Boudinots here? Well, the Boudinots are an ancient New Jersey family. Probably the most famous were the two brothers, Elijah and Elias Boudinots. They're from New Brunswick. Both of them, but particularly Elias, played a crucial role in Paterson's history. And we'll talk about him later on. As a matter of fact, the Boudinots actually had a legacy in Paterson for many years, but it's disappeared. And that was the fact that the lower end of Van Houten Street from Mill Street, basically from Mill to Main for all intents and purposes, originally was called Boudinot Street because the brothers were particularly the large financiers of the city in terms of providing money for the SUM. And they did play a particularly important role with Roswell years later. So this is who's writing this letter. It's a descendant of the Boudinots. And again, I would take it with a grain of salt. Obviously, Alexander Hamilton is the most historic, if you want to call that historic person associated with the city's development. And he did guide the development of the city through his writings, through his report on manufacturers, through all sorts of other kinds of things. So we do give him credit. But there is a lot of truth to this statement as well, that Roswell really was the person who took Paterson to where it needed to go, basically, in terms of development. So we're going to learn about him tonight. Okay. See if we can get the move here. Okay. Let's see. So I'm just going to tee off the end of creating a data set. So when I started this several years ago, I realized this is an important thing. The remnants of Roswell's life exist in a handful of libraries. Most notably, the big three for me are the Rutgers Library, the Alexander Library at Rutgers, the Pennsylvania Historical Societies. That's the largest one of all of them. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania, I should say. And the New York Historical Society played a critical role here too, for different reasons. There's about roughly, I'm guessing, around 2,000 letters that remain from Roswell Colt. At one time, they all lived together through descendants, basically. And unfortunately, the collection was broken up. A big chunk of it was donated by the Tollers, who were, again, another descendant of Roswell, the Toller family, to the Historic Society of Pennsylvania. Two large collections, and that's roughly, I think, around 1,200. Roughly 1,000 or so ended up at Rutgers. One actually fairly recently. There was a collection that was accumulated by Mr. Gilpin and Paterson in the 1940s and 50s. And he assembled this collection, and for whatever reason, half of it ended up going directly through one of the banks in Paterson, First National Bank in Paterson, ended up going to Rutgers in the 1970s. And just a few years ago, the other half of it, which again, this is sort of I'm circumspect, but I believe what happened is the other half apparently got separated and ended up going to Rutgers just a few years ago, was put up for auction at the Swan Galleries and ended up in Rutgers, basically. So they now have, I believe, to be the two halves that existed at one point in the 1970s were one group. So that's the bulk of it. But there are other letters and other places that are very important. For example, the Mystic Seaport Museum's library actually has a bunch of documents from the Mallard company, which was based in, I believe, in not Mist. Well, the building is now at the Mystic Seaport. The sail loft building was moved from right near Groton, Connecticut, moved to New London, Connecticut, moved to Mystic. And along with that came a collection of their documents. Well, I've actually found a lot of John Colt's documents. You don't know who John is yet, but we'll talk about him. John Colt's documents ended up there. And there's bits and pieces in museums, libraries all over the country. There's some up in Michigan. There's some in New York State. I actually have my own collection, about 100 Roswell documents. So they exist in a lot of places, but the bulk of them, again, are pretty much, the big bulk is Rutgers and Pennsylvania. And so what I did is, you'll see, I obviously have an Excel spreadsheet here. What I did is I attempted to go through their collections and put a database together, because this has never been done. In case of Rutgers, the letters are never cataloged. They're just stacks within boxes of all these letters, dates changing, correspondence, everything all mixed up. And so I needed to do this, because if I'm looking to try typography, I got to figure out his timeline. So this is a helpful tool using Excel, because I can see the date the letter was sent, and I can place Roswell in different locations and things. It sort of tells a part of the story for me too, chronologically and geographically, for that matter. But I'm still working on this. I haven't finished them all yet. I tried to put a short narrative about what's in the letter, and you can imagine when you are you're reading these letters, you're landing, again, particularly when they're not even identified who the corresponding person is. You land in this conversation, you don't know what they're talking about. And so that's why I put these notes together to sort of help me later on go back through it. There is, as I mentioned before, an unknown number of jigsaw puzzles. We have a lot of people with the same name. We're going to talk about John Devereaux a little bit later on. There's two John Devereaux in Roswell's life. And so trying to determine, it's one thing when it's in a letter, it's another thing when it's written in some other document, to try to figure out which one we're talking about. Anybody who's done geological research knows this. The names were used over and over again. And sometimes it's hard. You got to sort of use, again, dates and places to try to help you with that. Handwriting is always difficult. There's a letter in the collection from a famous lawyer in Maryland, where Roswell ended up in Baltimore for quite a few years. We'll see. Reverdy John, excuse me, not Reverdy. Yeah, Reverdy Johnson. He has an incredibly bad handwriting. It's almost like reading you know, an EKG strip. Okay, just it's hard to deal with that. So Roswell had his hand in a lot of things, and banking and finance was one of them. And some of the terminology is all really old stuff. And so I had to educate myself on, you know, what various kind of instruments, what kind of financial instruments were available to them at the time. And still, some of it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense at this point. But again, it's another thing we have to deal with. Abbreviations is another. Um, you know, making copies in some places. You know, the laptop is a great thing, but here's the problem. It takes me time to get through these letters to really understand them. And so things have loosened up quite a bit, actually. Thank God. A lot of the facilities wouldn't let you take pictures. Then they started to let you take pictures. And then now it's sort of like they're not really too concerned about it anymore. But there are facilities that will not let you copy. New Jersey Historical Society. Maybe I haven't been there in a few years, but New Jersey Historical Society would not let me even make a copy of a 1950s copy. So anyway, that becomes difficult because if you can't take a picture of it, you got to spend hours, of course, trying to write down detailed notes about what you find in there. So that's in some cases difficult. And of course, accessibility during the COVID crisis was a problem because you couldn't get access to a lot of things. So that's some of the difficult things. But let's talk about Roswell now. So that gives you a setup for the work I've been involved with trying to put this timeline together. So the general timeline for Roswell is this. He's born to Peter Colt and Sarah Lyman Colt on July 20th, 1779 in Wethersfield, Connecticut. You'll note that that's during the American Revolution. That's kind of important because this particular Colt family moved around quite a bit. Peter Colt, Roswell and John's father, was a commissary general in the war, and so he was responsible for food, logistics, things like that. And so they were constantly on the move. So Roswell ends up being born in Wethersfield. I've never found his birth certificate or anything up there. Gone through a lot of places to find it. It doesn't exist. So again, he moved in the early years throughout New England from Connecticut, you know, and they had family in Massachusetts. Anyway, so they're moving quite a bit during the Revolution. And finally, and that's kind of where our story starts, is the Colt family moves to Paterson in 1793. He's called in by, of all people, of course, recommended by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was familiar with Peter Colt, particularly during the Revolution. He would have known that Peter Colt was also had other attributes that could help the SUM, one of which was he was a financier. Colt left his position as the Connecticut state treasurer to come to Paterson, but he was also a merchant, okay? And most importantly, perhaps, we don't know because there's nothing's written down about this, but he was brought to Paterson because he was directly involved in the development of the Hartford Woolen Mill, which was an early attempt on weaving wool in the United States. And it's that woolen mill, of course, some of you know, that wove the clothing for George Washington's inauguration in New York City. So there was some notoriety to that facility. So it was kind of obvious that Peter Colt managed people. Peter Colt could manage money and stuff. So that would be a good reason to bring him there. So he brought him there in 1793. He ends up leaving in 1796 because the SUM has sort of run out of gas. It's had some financial problems. And so, you know, Peter is sort of discharged from his position, and we'll see some interesting things he did before he left. But he was, in fact, sort of let go because the SUM really didn't need him anymore because they were sort of cutting back, of course, really shutting down their manufacturing for a period of time. And so he ends up going to Rome, New York, to help Philip Schuyler. So, of course, Philip Schuyler is the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. Philip Schuyler is another Revolutionary War icon. Philip Schuyler was also attempting at this point, because in 1796 the war has been over for over 10 years now, and westward expansion and the look at transportation and the need for getting goods and services in and out of the hinterlands of particularly New York, in this case New York State, brought Peter Colt to Philip Schuyler to help develop what was called the Western Inland Canal. Again, we'll talk briefly about that later. And it's the key point when you can imagine this. Roswell Colt is a teenager. He's living in Rome, New York, which is basically Fort Stanwix, that area near, again, out in the hinterlands. And Roswell apparently was not happy chopping down trees for his father, who was actually a Yale graduate. His father ended up becoming a farmer in Rome, New York. And so Roswell was too happy about having to take on the farm life. I guess in his mind, he had higher aspirations. And Leroy Bayard, actually some representatives of Leroy Bayard that Peter knew, stopped by in Rome. They were dealing with the Indian treaties that were being developed at the time. And they said, "Hey, Roswell, how the heck would you like to work in New York City?" And he says, "I most certainly would." And that sort of sets him off on the path that takes us here Paterson. So Roswell leaves himself again as one of the children, leaves Rome, New York, becomes a partner at 1804. He's only in New York City for basically at most 4 years here, and he rises up through the ranks of becoming effectively a merchant prince, if you want to call it that. He was very smart, and people saw that, and he ended up becoming a partner at probably, again, you could do the math, 20 some odd years old. He's a partner at a merchant firm in New York City, doing really well for himself. He ends up gathering the attention of a very wealthy merchant in Baltimore, Robert Oliver. And it's hard to tell exactly. See, this is one of the things, again, about missing papers and missing documents. This early period doesn't have the level of documents that basically roughly from about 1815 forward, we got a lot more to deal with. But this early period, there's virtually nothing. And so this is all, again, pieces of the puzzle that I've been trying to figure out and put together. But he likely moves to Baltimore in 1809. And he ends up marrying the daughter of Robert Oliver in 1811. And he has a family in Baltimore, which we'll see. And so he's there with his wife, Margaret, Peggy. There'll be some astonishing facts you hear in a little while about the two of them. But he ends up actually coming back to New York City in 1837, lives down in Lower Manhattan, off Broadway and Park Place. And when he does that, he ends up realizing that he wants an expansive home like his father-in-law had in Greenmount in Baltimore. And so he built Roswell House roughly around 1840. And then Roswell dies in November of 1856. So that's a general overview. So we can get into a little bit of detail now. We'll go through his life. As I mentioned before, he was born in Wethersfield. He moved around with his father. And again, as I mentioned about the woolen factory, that was one of the main reasons I believe that Peter Colt was brought to Paterson to help get the SUM off the ground. Because as many of you know, Pierre L'Enfant was the original engineer to develop the mills, develop the raceways, develop all that kind of infrastructure. And for a variety of reasons, it didn't happen. And so they realized they had to get this thing kick-started. And so Peter Colt sort of assumed control of the development, the infrastructure development from Pierre L'Enfant. And so that's when he comes to Paterson. So in these early years, Roswell has some other siblings. And so we'll just run through them quickly. There was a brother named John who was born before Roswell. So remember, Roswell was born in 1779. Okay, so he had a brother, John, who apparently, and again, I can't find anything about him. I believe he's buried up in Hartford, but he must have died as a young child. There's no dates or anything on it. So, but we know he did exist, and so he passed away again as an infant or as a young child. So the next person after Roswell, Roswell again, born in 1779. The next child is Sarah Colt, followed by Catherine in 1784. John Colt, who will play a big role in tonight's talk, he's born in 1786. Mary Rice Colt is born in 1788. Richard Colt, who we don't know very much about, he was born in 1790. Harriet also don't know very much about her. You'll notice that there's a gap here, okay? 1792 to 1797. None of them were born in Paterson, okay? All of them were born, for the most part, somewhere in Connecticut, and it was a variety of places as they moved around. So you see, Julia Colt is born in 1797, and Mary T. Bainbridge Colt is born in 1799. So basically, those children were born in New York, Julia and Mary. The rest of them were born somewhere in Connecticut. So that's sort of his siblings, basically. And of course, John plays the biggest role in his life, but the others play a role to some extent. We'll hear a little bit about them. As I mentioned, Peter comes back in 1793, becomes effectively the superintendent at the behest of Hamilton. He, of course, gets things going. He realizes if this thing's gonna survive, they got to start making things, and so that means getting the first mill constructed and the first raceway constructed. And of course, some of you know that the very first mill wasn't even run by water; it was run by oxen. That's why it's called the bull mills, because they just wanted to get things in production. Now, of course, there's a lot of other people involved here, but Peter's the one overseeing the whole thing. And so he's got the children that you just saw, except for the last two. Those children are growing up in Paterson. So both Roswell and John and Mary and Catherine, all of them were, again, children living in what became Paterson, but weren't born there. And so in 96, again, Peter ends up moving up to Rome, New York, to help with the construction of the Western Inland Canal, the Wood Creek, Mohawk River area, basically. And that's where they go. Peter ends up buying several hundred acres of land up there. I was fortunate, the New York State map archivist, I think he was the top guy for maps in New York State. He found the map, and I found Peter's house actually on the map along the Wood River. And so I believe that the house is no longer there, but as you know, rivers do often change direction and change course over their history. So I'm not even sure exactly that's where them, I'd have to do more research to figure that out. But they did live in this home up there, and that's where, again, he was chopping trees down. Poor old Roswell as a young teenager, and I'm sure he got tired of doing that. So I told you before, he ends up leaving. It's William Bayard and Herman Leroy that visit them in the 90s and encourage Peter to allow Roswell to come down to New York City. Now, remember, Peter was a merchant himself. He had dealings with New York City. He spent a lot of time in New Haven, Connecticut. So he knew this group of people, basically, and all of them, again, involved in the revolution. So, he probably gave a long talk to Roswell, said, okay, Roz, you're going to go, and, this is going to maybe perhaps be your life's work and stuff. So, and it's important for Peter to let him go, because this is the reason Paterson is what is today. Okay, so he goes to New York City. He's involved in the counting house of Leroy Bear, which is basically the sort of scene that you see in Ebenezer Scrooge, the Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge, and the fellows that work in the front office there on those big tall tables that slanted. That's the kind of work he was doing there. But he was a very focused individual, there's no question about it. And Roswell was an incredibly smart individual. Never, to my knowledge, went to any college or university, even though his father was a Yale graduate. He didn't do it. His experience gave him his education, basically working in these types of facilities. And so he ends up working in this counting house and becomes a really smart young man that knows the merchant business after a couple of years. And so he's given the next highest job, which is to become a supercargo to various shipments from this firm to various points around the world, South America, but particularly over to Europe, basically. And so a supercargo is sort of the manager of the product on the ship. And so it's a great way for a young man in his 20s to go on the high seas and learn about what it's like to go to a port somewhere, another part of the world, basically, and negotiate the sale of these products and get, of course, get other materials back to New York City, basically. So he really understood the import export business very well. And this is the way a lot of these young men rose up through the ranks, is actually going out and doing the jobs that eventually they'll be paying other people to do. And it turns out he's going to Suriname and negotiating a settlement of some goods, and he comes down with a tropical disease, and it's the British Army surgeons in the Caribbean that he's on his way back to New York, and he's really, really sick. They revive him and bring him back to life. So, and remember, this is not that long after the American Revolution. So these British surgeons really saved Roswell's life, having, again, contracted, if it was malaria or whatever it was. I don't know exactly what the problem was, but it was some type of tropical disease they ended up with. So he comes back to New York after he's saved. He then ended up, again, becoming the partner in Jacob Leroy and Sons. And here's the important thing. He becomes an investor. So he's not just working and getting paid a salary. He's taking the money he does earn and investing it in ships, in products. And so that's where he really starts to take off, because as it was back then, if you're an import-export merchant in your firm, very often a lot of the senior people there would invest like 1/7 or 1/8 of the ship, meaning that they would build a new ship in some cases. 1/7 of it was owned by this person or that person. Well, Roswell did a lot of that, and he was very meticulous about building up his. He was not a wild man at the bar spending money all over the place. He invested his money over and over again, so he became fairly wealthy as a relatively young man. He built his own wharf on West Street and Leroy Street in Manhattan. So again, even though he's working for Jacob Leroy and Sons as the bigger firm, he invests in other people's ships, including John Jacob Astor ships as well. And these investments really come back to help him quite a bit. So it gives him money to do things. And so one of the discoveries I made was the New York Historical Society is that they have the Jacob Leroy account books. And I suspected maybe Roswell's in there. And sure enough, Roswell's own personal account book with the firm is in there. And there's an image of it there. And you can see about, if you can read that on your screen, the fourth line down is Paterson shares, $625. Paterson shares of the SUM, which is New Jersey's first corporation, business corporation, were running around $15 a piece by this point in 1809. So some of you have read the history of how Roswell came to take control of the SUM. This is the very first reference to him buying those shares. And guess who he's buying a lot from? Yes, the Boudinot's, because the Boudinot's had a lot of shares. And the Boudinot's, I am sure, looked at Roswell as, hey, this young man is a smart young guy, and he's going to take this SUM and really make it work. So we need to sort of sell him the shares so he can get control of the SUM, which of course is what he did. But these records, I don't think anybody's looked at them in 100 years. And sure enough, there's some really interesting stuff in there about who he associated with, who he paid for different things, and what have you. So this is his first time living in New York City, is the first decade, basically, of the 1800s. So what does he do? He keeps buying up more and more stock. And by 1814, he gets control of the board. Now, what's going on behind the scenes here is the fact that Peter Colt, again, he's still living in Rome. And of course, Roswell's telling Peter, Dad, hey, look, I've got control of the SUM. I need you to come back and help me with this. So it turns out that he ends up basically having Peter come back as sort of like the overseer of the development. And one very important point about Roswell, and I'm sure it was Peter's thoughts and John's as well, is that the SUM had to get out of the business of becoming the manufacturers themselves, and needed to get in the business of actually being the land developer and infrastructure builder. That is where the money was. And so that's why Peter came back, and I have documents where Peter's clearing land, Peter's taking himself. Now, Peter is born in, like, again, he's Peter in 1814, he's in his 60s. So he's clearing land and putting up fences and all sorts of stuff. It turns out that that Peter trades his farm to a man by the name of George Scribba. And George Scribba, we'll see here a little bit. George Scribba was an important player in Paterson. No one knows him. There's no street named after George Scribba, but George Scribba was a treasurer of the SUM at one point. And the two of them traded because George Scribba had a whole nother life up in upstate New York. He was a New York City merchant, but he had a whole life upstate New York where he basically bought 500,000 acres called the Roswell Patent, sort of north of Rome up to Oswego, Lake Ontario, that area. And so he wanted more land up there. And so he traded Peter for his farm. And Peter ended up with basically land for a house, but also ended up with the Passaic Hotel that you've read about in other places and stuff. That was one of the first hotels in Paterson. So Peter ends up with that. So Peter becomes the man on the scene to sort of run the USUM, get the things going. Again, he's Roswell's father. Roswell's brother doesn't come until roughly about 10 years later. So they're all working to developing Paterson, as I mentioned before. So Peter, having built the very first raceway, knows that, hey, we're going to build some more here. We're going to put mill seats in places where mills can build their building and actually have a trough or a canal to bring the water into the building. And that stuff had to be constructed. And so Peter really did a lot of that. And eventually later on, of course, we know the Morris Canal becomes a big issue for them because the SUM got the unique rights from the state of New Jersey to basically control the waters of the Passaic above the falls. And the Morris Canal was using that same water source years later. And we'll talk briefly about that later. The bottom right, you may be familiar with that photograph. That was Peter Colt's house that he built on Washington Street. Called it was and the cross. Well, it was originally called Mansion Street because I guess it was for his house, but it became Washington Street behind City Hall, basically. And you'll notice that it looks like there's a front door on the second floor. That's true because what happens is the city of Paterson bought it for their very first built City Hall and raised the building by an entire story. And so that's the building that if you watch the program we did on the Great Fire at Paterson, you see the outline of that end wall there. It got burnt out by the 1902 fire, but it lasted right up to that point. So that was Peter's house. What else is going on in these early days? Well, that's what happens to John. John ends up going to follow his brother into the merchant business in New York. And there's a thoughtful letter that I did find from Roswell to John saying, John, you must ask Father whether or not you should do this because this is a difficult thing to do. And you can imagine he's trying to give him brotherly advice to get his father's permission to do that. And of course, I guess at this point, Peter's thinking, boy, Roswell's doing pretty good. Maybe John will as well. And so John ends up doing effectively the same thing, becomes a supercargo, and gets to learn the lay of the planet through merchant shipping, basically. And what Roswell does for John is he takes some of John's earnings. And again, they were very thrifty people. They knew to save their money and stuff. So Roswell takes John's money and invests it in a nail mill with Samuel. This is not the same Samuel Colt, the gun Colt. This is a Samuel Colt from Newark, a Nicostella plane. And again, John is an investor in this, and off goes this nail mill. They eventually become a rolling mill and produce a variety of products for the War of 1812. Samuel Colt ended up leaving in 1822. He's an interesting story. They closed the nail mill in 28, and they actually rented out the rolling mill to other firms. The Jacksons from Morris County came in and ran it for a while. And then, of course, what ends up happening, this painting, you've probably all seen it. You're standing basically on the Passaic River, looking toward where the Colt gun mill would be today. That fountain of water coming down, that is still there to this day. And eventually, when the raceways get working again, that's the overflow that actually goes back into the Passaic River from the Middle Canal. So that's the Middle Canal that parallels the mills along Mill Street. So if you were to go behind all those mills on Mill Street, if you go up Lawrence Kramer Extension, if you go up the McBride Avenue Extension, you go up that hill, you're going up and over the Middle Canal, Middle Raceway. That's what you're seeing shooting over the side. And that was, again, the famous nail mill. And it was torn down because, it was an original wood frame building. It was not the stone buildings that a lot of the other ones we were trying to develop. So they tore it down because it became an opportune site to build the gun mill. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. Let's talk about the duck mill. So John is doing pretty well financially. He decides that cotton duck is a real big need, right? Particularly for bags, canvas bags, and things like that, but also for sails for ships. And so we know there's a discussion going back at least as 1815 between John and Roswell. We do have quite a few letters between those two brothers because basically Roswell saying, do this, do that, help this, help that, and letting Roswell make a lot of decisions. Now, by 1822, we're only 2 years before Peter dies. So Peter's getting up in age, and he's sort of the patriarch. Obviously, he's the patriarch. But John is assuming a bigger role now. John sort of takes over from his father to be the on-site guy running Paterson, okay, in the 1820s and the 1830s, and to some extent even beyond that. But the 20s and 30s, it's John who's sort of running Paterson in terms of, again, the infrastructure development, all that stuff. So John is interested in making money too, not just through the SUM, but other ways. So he develops this idea about developing a cotton duck mill. So he does that in 1822. Well, guess what happens? He figures out the best way to have a double strand twisted that uses cotton, not flax, to develop a sail for ships that is very much resistant to mold and rot. And this sailcloth takes off. It becomes the standard sailcloth for the U.S. Navy for decades, basically. And it's all being produced at the duck mill, also called the Passaic Mill. And over the years, John moved the production around from building to building, but basically was producing this top-notch cotton sailcloth, which, as I told you, I found documents from the Mallory sailcloth merchant up in Connecticut, receipts from Roswell and John and Jabez Colt as well. So we know a little bit about that. It gets so popular that John opens up a store at 9 Burling Slip in New York. And so John very often is traveling from Paterson in the 30s and 40s. From Paterson, he's a commuter into New York City. So it's not getting on the Jersey Transit. He's got a few things to deal with. So anyway, he does very, very well. And of course, the most famous aspect, which a lot of you know, is the fact that the sails that won what's now become the America's Cup on the yacht, the America, built in Hoboken, the sails on that yacht were made in Paterson. And if any of you, I'll mention this book now, if you're really interested in, so where some people in Roswell and John sort of blend into Samuel Colt's life, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Revolver. It's a wonderful book by a guy by the name of Jim Rassenberger. And it talks about John being at the what was effectively the World's Fair in London at the same time as Samuel's there showing off his gun. There's John being so proud of his yacht just having won that race. So a lot of overload. So Colt moves to Baltimore. Yeah, we're going to get moving here. Colt moves to Baltimore roughly around 1809. Jacob Leroy dies in 15, and so Roswell has to come back and settle and close all the accounts. But Roswell's pretty much invested in Baltimore at this point. Who's Robert Oliver? Oh yeah. How many of you know where Oliver Street is? That's where the name comes from, Robert Oliver. 1757 to 34. He's one of the most wealthy merchants. He provided a lot of the funds to Roswell, probably that was used to build the raceway system, particularly the middle raceway, and to some extent the upper raceway. It was Robert's money that helped invest in that. And well, we'll see here in a minute what happens. I'll show you this just real quickly. If you look in the house in the center there, you notice that it's sort of two designs. And Marty Filowitz, who's on the call tonight or on the webinar tonight, could tell us that there's sort of this Roman side and this sort of Georgian side on the other side that was very popular back then, apparently. That is Robert Oliver's house, his country estate. He lived in downtown, but he had a country estate in what the section of Baltimore called Greenmount. That is where the Greenmount Cemetery is in Baltimore today. The house was torn down, but the Oliver family is all buried in the same property that they effectively owned. It was one of those early, very well-designed cemeteries. The house on the left there was Robert Oliver's sort of little country house for hunting and things like that, near the Gunpowder Creek in the Eastern Shore. Okay, one of the things that still exists from Roswell and his wife Margaret, who were married on October 5th, 1811, is this wonderful, sort of unusual stand here. Basically, it is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So if you ever want to see it, it's there. It's one of the few things that remains in that marriage, though. We'll see here in a second. Here's Roswell's wife on the right. That's Peggy, as she was called. It's the only known image of either two of them, which the other young girl is Roswell's daughter and Peggy's daughter, Mary Devereaux Colt. Peggy, well, give me a sec here. Let's just point out, this is a painting done in which you can see that they're at her father's, Peggy's father's estate. There's the house in the back, okay? The same house we just looked at. Okay, now, hope you're sitting down right now. Two of them, Margaret and Peggy Margaret, and Roswell had 21 children, okay? Now look at the dates spread. Now here, roughly 10 of them survived into adulthood. I'm missing a few because some of them were not named, but there were a few that were, well, to tell you the truth, all of them were born in Baltimore, every one of them, okay? But look at the dates here, 1812, all the way up to, my screen is blocked here, what the last year is. Hold on a sec here. 1835, okay? So that's another whole program for another day to go through these children. But I wanted to show you that not good things happen not too long after 1835 here. And you'll see here in a second. So that's the list of children that the two of them had. The only reason I know it's 21 because there was one letter that Roswell wrote to a friend of his, one of the John Devereaux. Now, this particular John Devereaux I'm talking about, we'll see in a second. He was a mercenary from Ireland that fought with Simon Bolivar in South America. Okay, he was very close to Roswell. They both worked in Oliver's merchant house when Roswell moved to Baltimore. And Devereaux was the person that Roswell sort of expressed his personal feelings about a lot of stuff. And so the only reason I know there were 21 is because of that letter. There's as I said before, there's very few letters from Roswell that, very few letters from Roswell that actually still exist that deal with personal issues. 98% business, 2% personal. One of the other John Devereaux is John Corish Devereaux, born in Wexford, also around the same time as the other John Devereaux. He emigrated in 1797. He eventually goes to Utica, New York, and he marries one of Roswell's sisters, Mary, in 1815. He ran a dry goods store up there. He was very, very successful, and he eventually becomes the president of the Utica branch of the Bank of the United States, which we'll see here in a second. Very important in Roswell's life, the BUS. Here's the other John Devereaux. Now, that's not him. That's actually Simon Bolivar, also born in Wexford, Ireland, was probably a participant in the Irish Rebellion of 1798, moved to Baltimore, again, where Roswell is. They become close friends. It's John Devereux who raises the Irish Legion to fight with Bolivar in Venezuela in the 1820s. And he was a constant visitor to Roswell. And when we show the Roswell house here in a little bit, you'll see the lodge. This is where he stayed. He was very much in Roswell's life, particularly when it was obtaining farm animals and things like that we'll see about. And he dies in 1860. I throw Charles Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's also the last surviving signer. He is the grandfather of what's called the Caton sisters. That's where Catonsville, Maryland is named after. He is one of the wealthiest Americans at the time. He thinks so much of Roswell. He makes Roswell the economic advisor to these three sisters, or excuse me, three grandchildren of his, who each one of them, for the most part, marries into English aristocracy. It's a whole interesting book. It's also written about them, and Roswell, again, appears in this book several times, basically. And Carroll thinks so much of Roswell Colt that he is the witness to the last will and testament of Carroll. I mean, this is one of the most wealthiest guys in the country. And here's Roswell to see. Oh, there's the Sisters of Fortune they just mentioned. There actually, well, that's right, there was a fourth granddaughter, but three of them end up marrying into English aristocracy. It's another book you might like to read. Colt is a trustee for a variety of things because he's thought to be a smart guy financially, an advisor basically. And in those days, you get a commission for being a trustee of an account. It's sort of like it would basically be the role of a lawyer today. But back then, they would have different people do that, and they were allowed to take a percentage of the monies that they were dealing with. And in a lot of cases, he ended up having to go after money that was owed to these various estates, particularly this guy Lemuel Taylor in Baltimore. During the early 1800s, France basically took over a lot of American shipping, ships, brigs, what have you, and lost a lot of money in that. And for decades, even after Roswell's long dead, it was called the French spoliations that went on for many years, trying to get money out of France to pay for all the stolen goods, basically, of the early 1800s. And so he did that. He was also involved in a particular case of Samuel Francis Scott Key, basically, and some land down in southern United States, the Southeast. So he was really involved in a lot of stuff. One of his biggest friends was Nicholas Biddle, who was a well-known guy. He's most well-known as the head of the second Bank of the United States, which is a whole nother several textbooks about that whole situation. But Roswell Colt was one of his biggest friends and actually advisor to him for not only finance, but for horticulture as well. They all are related. Biddle married into the Craig family, which includes Robert Oliver's wife. So there's a lot of interesting things. If any of you want to take a nice trip in the spring or summer, go to the Andalusia estate. It's on the Delaware River in North Philadelphia. It's the home of the Biddles, and you'll see some paintings in there that are really impressive, as well as a lot of the decor of Nicholas Biddle. The other famous thing is about him was he was the man who wrote up Lewis and Clark's expeditions to the West and basically made a book of it for all intents and purposes. Roswell's involved with the Bank of the United States because Nicholas Biddle helps him, first as a Baltimore branch officer, director, and later on at the national level with the Bank of the United States. He's involved with Roswell's involved with a whole bunch of money craziness in Baltimore, where money was stolen and things, and there was rioting, and poor Roswell was accosted during this thing. I mean, it's another, it'll end up in my book, but know that Roswell was a key player in finance nationally, but including in Baltimore itself. The bank wars, which is where Bill gets into a situation with Andrew Jackson when he was president. Andrew Jackson hated the Bank of the United States, basically prevented its re-chartering in 1840. He shut it down earlier and ended up, perhaps most, I think economists would agree, the very first major depression in the United States, they called it a panic back then, was probably caused by the shutdown of the Bank of the United States, because money flow came to a grinding halt, because it was the only bank that literally moved money across state lines, basically, and they reverted back to the way it used to be within states, and that was a big problem. Roswell's an investor in the railroads. He's basically identified as a director of the B&O Railroad, one of the first in the United States. Robert Oliver is an investor in that, so I'm sure that's why it was. The Patapsco Canal, the Baltimore and Port Deposit Railroad, and of course later on the Paterson Hudson River Railroad. That's the piece of the railroad today which goes from Market Street, that station, basically a little further east of where it originally was, but that rail line that works its way to Jersey City back then, and to the ferries, basically, that's where Roswell is the guy who sets that up. And it's incredible the level of Roswell's involvement in a lot of stuff. And he just basically, he's a smart guy that gets down into the weeds of details. I have a letter in my own collection where Roswell wrote to Major Torrey in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, named after Roswell's friend Philip Hone, the mayor of New York City. Honesdale became a major lumber industry center, and Roswell writes a letter to the major out there saying, hey, we're building a railroad across the Salt Marsh to New York. What are the best kind of railroad ties I should have? And he gives suggestions and things. And anyway, just incredible stuff. Roswell ends up coming as he invests. Once you get past the merchant investments, to tell you the truth, in the first half of the 19th century, there's like not a lot of corporations you can invest in, but there are some. And so he invests in a lot of them, particularly mining industries and coal and iron. George's Creek, Roswell's a player out there. He goes and visits the mine with his son Roswell Jr. That's a guy by the name of Duff Green. I put that picture in there because Duff, another famous player in American history of that time period, with that big pole. I thought that was kind of a cool picture of him. But Duff Green knew Roswell really well. Roswell makes one mistake with Daniel Webster, another close friend of Roswell, when they buy a gigantic piece of property that borders Missouri and Arkansas called the Clay Morgans, the Clay Morgan tract. To make a long story short, it's a piece of land that ends up in dispute because originally it was part of, before the Louisiana Purchase, it was under Spanish control, then French control out of St. Louis, and eventually one of the major players there in that book, by the way, you'll read about him, the Clay Morgans, that individual had sold this large piece of property to big investors in Baltimore, but others as well, including Daniel Webster, Samuel Southard, a politician from New Jersey, and it got wrapped up in the courts. And it's, again, another interesting story where Daniel Webster used his position in the Senate as a senator to try to influence this through the U.S. Supreme Court. Anyway, it's another, again, I'm just touching the highlights here through all these parts of Roswell's life. All right, so we know all about the gun mill. Roswell's living in Baltimore, okay, and he meets Samuel. We have the letter where Samuel says, Mr. Colt. They both have the same last name. They're second cousins. Mr. Colt, I came to see you and missed you. You weren't home. Can I come to see you? Well, Sam Colt goes to Roswell for money. Okay. Sam Colt's father is Christopher Colt. His brother is Christopher Jr. They don't have very much money. Christopher Colt was a silk manufacturer. The father of Sam kind of went back, for all intents and purposes, went bankrupt. And so Roswell ends up being a bank for Samuel to not only build the factory, because John Colt and Roswell were directly involved in the construction of that gun mill, but also invested in Samuel's efforts, including more famous effort was because Sam was not good with money. He was the opposite of Roswell. He blew through it. He needed to go to Florida to try to sell his guns to the Army fighting the Seminoles. and he takes a bunch of the Paterson Colts with him in these big box crates, goes to Florida, is able to sell some of them, and Roswell bankrolled this. And on the way back in St. Augustine, Samuel is wants to get home too quickly, and he ends up going out to doesn't want to wait until the storm is past. He tries to go out to the ship to go back up the coast again, and he ends up dumping a bunch of those Paterson Colts into the harbor of St. Augustine. They're still to this today. I'm sure they're still there if you could find them. But the bottom line was he was out of a lot of money now because these were guns that were consigned to Sam to sell. So Roswell untangles that to a great extent. So that book, Revolver, has that story in there, and I think you might find it interesting. And of course, the gun mill lasts only from 36 to 42 for all intents and purposes in the gun mill. Other thing that the gun mill mentioned is that Sam's brother, Christopher Jr., brings the very first silk to Paterson and weaves the very first silk. And he's only there a few months. I just only recently, in the last 6 months, actually found documentation from the exact time he was there. He was only there for 3 months, basically. He brought all this equipment from New York. It was not successful. He left the equipment behind. And what ends up happening, basically, is that John Ryle finds out about it through a man by the name of George Murray in New York City, who was most famous for white lead. And the man is an investor, and he tells John Ryle, hey, let's go over to Paris and look at that silk equipment. And it's from there on that Ryle gets that mill going. And of course, that's the start of everything for silk and Paterson. But it was Christopher Colt, Sam's brother, who actually brought the first equipment to the city for manufacturing silk cloth. Roswell also invested in his submarine battery, which was basically an underwater mine. Okay. So what ends up happening basically is that this is like 1837 is roughly when Roswell moves back. Now, why does he move back? A couple reasons. One is because I'm sure that the secondary reason is probably because he wanted to be closer to what's going on in Paterson because it's really taking off at this point. The other, much larger and the predominant issue was that he was on the outs with his wife, Peggy. Robert Oliver died a couple years earlier, and my interpretation, everything is that Peggy's two brothers turn on Roswell and make Roswell's life a living hell in Baltimore, and basically force him to leave. And that's one of the reasons why. So what ends up happening is Roswell leaves his wife, takes 4 of the children with him to Paterson, or to New York, and then to Paterson. 6 of the kids stay with Peggy. She ends up moving to Paris the remainder of her life. She lives in Paris with the children. Some of them, of course, move on, but basically she ends up living in Paris. So they split up. In his records, there are documents about separation and divorce. He apparently decided not to divorce her, so they were just basically permanently separated at that point. And we'll talk about her again later on. Anyway, more importantly, he ends up moving to New York, finds a house at 25 Park Place. That's right off Church Street, basically. It's the building on the left. There's a woman in a white dress there. It's the one sort of to her left, or to her right. That's 25 Park. It no longer exists. It's been replaced by a building that actually became the Daily News at one point, and stuff. So this is right off Broadway. There's that City Hall Park in front where those trees are at the end of the street. But that's where he lived for several years while the Roswell house was being built. He became a member of the Home Club, which is an exclusive gentleman's club in New York. The Drapers, Hones, Grinnell, those are the folks you see down below. Hone was a merchant. He's famous for one big reason, besides being being mayor for only 1 year. Back then, they ran for 1 year. He was also famous because he kept a diary. And so we know a lot about him and Roswell based upon that. And they met at each other's homes. What's important about that is all the major political players of the day, when it went to New York, ended up cycling through the Home Club. So the famous scene for Roswell is at Roswell's house at the Park Place there you saw. He has a party which President Adams is an attendee. And Roswell, as I told you before, get your glass of Madeira wine. Roswell had one of the best wine cellars of anybody in the Northeast. Okay, well, I could say in the country probably at that point. He was well known for that, and he loved Madeira wine. That was his big thing. And so he brought out a tray of 14 glasses of Madeira, different Madeira wines. And Adams, President Adams, could identify, I think it was 11 of the 14, exactly the brand of what Madeira wine that was. So he was an incredible, Roswell had an incredible interest in grapes, particularly, but horticulture in general. But he was a wine enthusiast. Was he an alcoholic? I don't think so. His brother-in-laws both said he was. I don't believe it because I just don't see how you can be this successful, and basically be an alcoholic at the same time. I guess you could be, but I don't. There's no other inkling I have anywhere where anyone mentions that specific, other than this one letter that Roswell wrote to John Devereaux saying he was being accused of a variety of things, including being an alcoholic. But I don't believe he was. This is a portrait that was commissioned by the home club of Webster, because Webster was in New York a lot and would visit with these folks. Roswell ends up giving Webster. All right, already mentioned that. There's Madeira wine. There's a guy by the name of Thurlow Weed. How do you like that? He's another member of the club down there. Hold on one sec. I think I have a picture later on, but Webster was also, as many of these politicians were, they were very much interested in agriculture. Okay, and so Roswell actually sends two gigantic cattle bulls up to Marshfield, Massachusetts, where Webster's house was, because Webster had his own farm up there, basically. So they were very friendly to each other. All right, talked about the Madeira wine, throw a little weed down there in the bottom. The other thing Roswell gets involved in is roughly around the same time as the famous killer cult, which was Samuel Colt's other brother, John. Now, these are two different Johns now. John is Roswell's brother, but there's another brother, John, who's Sam's brother. It was one of the most famous cases of the 19th century in which John Colt, who became a noted bookkeeper and wrote the standard textbook for double entry bookkeeping, he ended up murdering his publisher, basically. That's when he's got the guy by the neck there. And he basically shot him, chopped him up into several pieces, put him in a crate, put it on a ship bound for New Orleans, but the ship didn't leave on time. And of course, the odor created an interest, and people opened the crate up, found it was Mr. Adams, and John Colt ends up going to eventually goes to prison. Roswell does throw $500 at the legal defense of this John, and makes a note. I don't want to hear anything more about this. Okay. John Roswell was very close with Mr. Seward, Governor Seward. Okay, remember him from the Lincoln assassination. All right, well, he was governor of New York at the time. Roswell was close with him, and there's not one letter where Roswell says, "Hey, get this guy out of this. Give him a pardon, or absolve him of this murder." Basically, never happened. And so John eventually did end up dead. Theoretically, we think he did, because there's a whole interesting story on that, and that's the book about it. If you're interested in reading more about that, they did split up, as I mentioned before. And one of the interesting things I found was the silver set made by the Kirk firm in Baltimore. It's a top-end silver firm. There was a fight for years between Margaret and Roswell over that silver set. And Roswell said, "Look, I paid for it. It's mine." Da, da, da. And then finally, years later, these are going back and forth between attorneys, basically. And eventually Roswell said, let her have it. So there were two pieces of this collection that end up in the Passaic County Historic Site, which at some point disappeared. There were two napkin rings out of the set of silver. Okay, there's the house that you're probably familiar with, Ward, Maine, Prince and Grand. That little building on the bottom there, that's the lodge that Devereaux would have stayed in, okay, when he came to visit. Roswell also had, we don't have pictures of it, at least we don't think we have pictures of it. Roswell had a farm going all the way over to Bridge Street, where all that flooding is going to be next couple of days. Bridge Street over there, that goes right up to the river. That area was a whole large, several hundred-acre farm that Roswell had as well. Roswell had, on this particular piece of property on the photo, had a pond, had all sorts of interesting things, animals, what have you, and a greenhouse. That's the painting of that. that used to hang at the Lambert Castle before the society had to move out for the restoration. That's in storage now. Ed Smike, actually, the county historian, only got that, had donated it about 7, 8 years ago. A person approached him about it, and it was donated to the society. Um, Here's a couple really rare images. This next couple slides inside the Roswell house. And oh, by the way, let me go back again real quick. Notice, remember I told you about how it looks like Greenmount? See the Roman columns and the other side of it was, is not, it's more that contemporary period basically. That apparently was very popular, and he copied what Robert Oliver did for his house. These images I'm going to show you I don't think have ever been seen recently in the last 100 years. They showed up on the one on the left that you've seen before with the two famous statues, sandstone carved statues that eventually ended up in the Paterson Library and were also destroyed in 1902 fire. They are both Irish sort of folk heroes that were carved, for Roswell, and they lived on his front entrance, basically. This other picture on the bottom right, and the next few are all images from a set of stereo view cards that showed up on eBay a couple of years ago. And it turns out that I was desperate to try to get these because I knew how important they were, and I did not get them. I went up over $2,000 myself. I had to try to get it, couldn't get it. But that's a picture of the greenhouse of Roswell's house there. I was fortunate that the person selling it was very nice to me because I reminded them that I got them the price that they got. And so they scanned these pictures for me. So I want to share them with you. There's another one of the greenhouse on the bottom left. As I mentioned before, Roswell was a major horticulturist, wrote to all the journals of the time, put his materials on display, put them up for competition, particularly grapes, black Hamburgs, things like that. That was his thing. He was an expert on grapes in America, but a lot of other stuff as well. That's an interior shot. I'm not sure which room this was. The next one coming up, again, these are a weird angle here for you, but the one on the bottom right, because again, this is off of a scan. If you look very carefully, you can see the greenhouse behind one of these two images. And of course, there's a central staircase inside the house. Who that is, I don't know. It's got to be probably a granddaughter of Roswell's, is my guess. These were taken after he passed away. His daughter and his son-in-law ended up taking over the SUM, or his son-in-law, and they ended up living in there in the house. So I'm sure it was taken during that time period. A little bit more about the house. It was valued $120,000 in 1850. You can tell how much that was. There were 4 servants. They were not slaves, but there were 2 African Americans that were servants that lived at the house. As I mentioned before, Tam O'Shanter and Souter Johnny are the 2 statues, and the farm there. Roswell wrote up the description of his house for one of the agricultural journals of the day, and actually he paid for these etchings to be put in the journal so people know what the kind of house he had. Roswell was a gigantic Whig, HIG, which was the predecessor for the most part to the Republican Party. He was a major insider. He wrote letters all the time. I have one in my collection that he wrote to James Watson Webb, the editor of the Courier Enquirer, which was the competitor with the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett's paper, talking about the Hungarian Revolution. So Roswell had an opinion about a lot of things. He literally wrote testimonies to Congress. He was in all what was called, back in those days, the interior. And what we would call infrastructure today, they called improvements, which meant roadways, canals, stuff like communications, things like that. And it's hard to believe this, but Roswell really was one of the 2 or 3 people that motivated Congress to create the Department of the Interior. And we think of the Department of the Interior today as like that has the National Park Service, like Paterson, has all those things. Back in those days, it was really about development and controlling the interior of all these U.S. federal lands that was owned by the government, that no one really had a lot of control over. So we actually got the Department of Interior thanks to Roswell. Roswell, again, never went to college. I could ever tell. His brother John did. Went to what became Hamilton College in New York State, but Roswell never did. He contributed to the Paterson schools before there was a Paterson school district, decades before. He was on the board of trustees of Princeton University. He had a lot of influence down there. He was very familiar with the faculty and with the various administrators and stuff. And he did Princeton's very first scholarship, for name, and of course in his name, basically. So he was a philanthropic guy. A lot of you know that he basically, any of the churches that came to Paterson during the early SUM period, every single one of them, he gave the land to build the church. Because listen, it was beneficial to him because he realized that if workers wanted to go to a church, be it Roman Catholic, Episcopal, Methodist, Presbyterian, whatever, that it meant a lot to their lives to come to Paterson because they go to church and they could work, right? So Roswell understood that. But, he didn't have to do that. He literally gave tracts of land, and including the Presbyterian Church, where he was a member, Main and Ward, that legacy comes from the SUM. Okay, that property was SUM property, basically. So, again, he was a very philanthropic guy. Science, he was writing constant letters about trying to improve things. I mean, he wasn't the inventor of the light bulb, but all the different kinds of making improvements, particularly, again, agriculture, horticulture. He was very interested in geology. He pays for the first geological study in 1842 by Henry Doran Rogers. He is a society member of all the particularly Presbyterian-related entities, the Tract Society, Colonization Society, Bible Society, Home Missionary Society. He ends up buying land in Liberia for the population of the new Colonization Society, which was giving, it's a very perhaps it's a dark period of American history where, folks were, particularly slave owners, were even included in this. They were interested for any slaves that were freed not to stay in the United States, to offer them the opportunity to go back to Liberia, back to Africa, basically. And so Roswell played a role in that, which a lot of men of the 19th and to some extent women of the 19th century did. I mean, we look differently about it today, of course, but he was very much involved with that. As I mentioned, the Presbyterian Church. In the background of that photo is his sister Sarah. Many of you know that created one of the first Sunday schools, certainly in New Jersey, but in the country. Sunday schools were the schools for children. It wasn't just religious, but it was alphabet and math and things like that. She's the one who did that. That's her portrait inside the building before the city took it over when the church gave it up a few years ago. Again, horticulture. He was known for his grapery, which is the infrastructure, the structure to actually grow the grapes. He corresponded to all the journals, and including this fellow named Andrew Jackson Downing, the father of American landscape architecture and buildings. This is the guy. He's up in Newburgh, New York. And there's a few letters out there, one of which is in my collection, where he's buying various types of pears and apple trees from Downing for his farm in Paterson, basically. And Downing actually has another letter, which I think is in the Pennsylvania Star Study, where Downing writes him a letter while Downing is putting in the very first park at the Smithsonian in Washington on the Mall, telling Roswell, hey, I'm here. This is how I'm designing and stuff. I met some academics who write about that, and they never heard of this letter before. I said, yeah, well, he talks about it, actually, what he's doing down there. So Roswell is at the center of a lot of stuff. Again, Brisca and Kossuth, he ends up sending Kossuth, of course, the revolutionary Kossuth, right? They named a bull after him, and that's the one that goes up to, he sends it up to Daniel Webster. It is attributed the fact that to Roswell that he was the guy who brought the very first common swan to the United States. That one's a tougher one. I found the references to it, but I got to find an earlier one somewhere in Roswell's papers, perhaps, that talk about that and things. Roswell in later years, this is a photograph, I believe, of a daguerreotype that a family member, a descendant of the Colts, who still live in Maryland, had shared with me. I don't know if that's actually him or not. I just only about a month ago, the museum and the Paterson Foundation were approached by individual in New England who actually has, and we've determined it to be the case, a portrait of Roswell later in life. We think it was done about 1849. And so we're going to be acquiring that painting. I didn't include it tonight, but I just wanted to let you know that we actually have a painting that pretty much definitively is him. And so that's be another nice addition to the collection at the museum. But this comes down from the family. I have to believe it is. I'm gonna have to take the two of these painting and this one, which is a little bit later, and just figure out this has got to be the early to mid 1850s, basically, of him. Margaret, his wife, let's talk about her again. She dies in, notice it here, October 8th, 1856 in Paris. She's interred at Greenmount, again, her father's former country estate, basically. October 8th, 1856, look what happened. December 5th, 56, Roswell dies. He's very first, actually, I think there's a mistake there. It's November 5th, I believe. He dies at his home. The city shuts down for the entire day. It's national news when Roswell dies. All the mills shut down out of respect for Roswell. And eventually he's buried at the Presbyterian Cemetery, which is, as you know, the Sandy Hill area of Paterson was all the cemeteries for the same thing, the SUM, land for the Presbyterians, land for the Episcopals, land for the Methodists, land for the Catholics. They all had their own individual cemeteries on Sandy Hill. Of course, all of you that are Eastside High School graduates know the mascot of Eastside High School is, in fact, the ghost. For that reason, is because that high school is built on one of the cemeteries there. So he's built there, and then eventually later on, his family moves him and Peter, Roswell's mother, Sarah Lyman Colt, moves all of them to Cedar Lawn, is where they are today. That stone, the really cracked one in the middle there, that's Peter's stone. I went to it about a month ago, and it's pretty much. I'm glad I took other pictures of it close because the inscriptions are pretty much almost gone out of it now because it's laying flat basically on the ground. What are the physical reminders of Roswell? Here's the entrance to Westside Park. That's one of them. Okay, those two entry portals, those pillars there, were from one of the entrances to the Roswell Colt mansion, and they got moved there. And perhaps they're going to be restored as part of the Westside Park upgrade that they're doing over the next few years. But in reality, the legacy of Roswell is what you're looking at there. He's the guy that really got the SUM to develop the city as a real estate entity, brought all those factories in, negotiated prices for mill seats, built buildings for them, basically with mortgages, did a lot of different things to actually get Paterson to be the industrial center it became. And so we got to really think that Roswell, is worthy of being recognized in the city. He really isn't. Some of you know there's a Colt Street, one of the shortest streets in Paterson, but that street is actually named after John because John's house was right there next to City Hall. So we think, a bunch of us, that one day perhaps we'll get a statue of Roswell and maybe John, maybe Peter, Sam. My thought would be at the corner of Mill and Boudinot Streets, aka Van Houten Streets there, because that's really the center of what was going on, and it is worthy of recognition, certainly, no doubt about that. But in any case, I hope you've enjoyed this. I have definitely gone way over time here. It's almost 8:30. So if there are any questions, please, I don't see any yet in the Q&A, but thank you for your attention. And like I said, I just scraped the surface of all this. So there's a lot more to him that I hope one day, like I said, will be all put down on paper that you can read and hopefully enjoy and learn a little bit more about how important a man this particular individual was. So let me stop share here. Okay, in the chat room, I think there's something. Oh, there's a question coming in here. Tamo Shenter. Okay. All right, Scotch. Thank you, James. Yes, you're right. I'm too tied to Wexford, Ireland. That's why. So you're right. There's Scotch. That's right. Thank you for correcting me on that. Let's see what we got in the
Hey,
Q&A.
Glenn,
Yes.
only you can see the chat, so you need to tell everybody what you just corrected.
Okay. So let's see. JD pointed out that Tam O'Shanter is by Robert Burns Scotch, not Irish. Correct. Thank you. I stand corrected. I was too excited about talking about it and made that mistake. So uh, anyway, so that was the point about that. Now we've got some questions here. Why was the early duck mill so called? Because that was the name that cotton canvas was given, duck. I would assume and again, I'm not an expert on cloth and things, but I would imagine that it probably was given that name because it shed water, like a duck's back would shed water. I think that's probably why it was called duck. But it was basically canvas that he had woven with the intent on being strong and rot resistant. That was the biggest problem of sailcloth, was packing it away wet, because then it just rotted and you get end up with holes in it. The other thing about cotton duck was the fact that a lot of the other versions of it were flax. There was another manufacturer, John Travers, down the block, down Van Houten Street at the Phoenix Mill, also was a cotton duck manufacturer. But it was Colts that was the most famous. And the other person involved here I should mention is our friend Thomas Rogers, who we know for the locomotives. Thomas Rogers started as a machinist, basically, working for the Godwin firm, right, doing particularly textile machines, Godwin Clark, and effectively became an expert, as he built larger and larger pieces of equipment to do different things. Well, John came over to him and said, Tom, can you build me this water frame, or basically a weaving machine for heavier cotton, because I want to make sails out of it. Can you build me a water powered loom, basically for this type of operation? And so those very first water powered looms that Thomas Rogers built, that were the ones that actually produced the very famous bolts of cotton duck cloth, basically. So there's a lot on that. Let's see here. Is Carroll Street named after Charles Scott? No, it's not. That's another Carroll in Paterson, Joe. Not the Carrolls of Baltimore or Maryland, but a Carroll family in Paterson. Are there any descendants around these days, JD? Yes, there are. The descendants that I met are there's two groups of them. One, or actually two particular individuals. One was a woman, as a woman lives outside of Baltimore. She shared a lot of information she had from her grandmother and mother. That's where that photo came of I showed you. Um, that that part of the family is, and I haven't gone back to figure out. It's a Meta. I think Meta, the girl you saw in the portrait, was her not direct, but her ancestor, basically, and that part of the family, that particular girl from the Roswell's and Margaret's children. So I believe it was her. The other one I met, which is important to note because I didn't pay a particular lot of attention, which I should have. The portrait you saw at the very beginning of the lecture of Roswell as a painting him, that was done by Thomas Sully, famous out of Philadelphia. He was probably one of the more, he wasn't the top tier, but one of the probably the top 5 portrait artists of the 19th century. And he's pretty famous. He's the one who did the portrait of Roswell. That portrait, though, I've always been intrigued with it because if you look at it, and maybe I can just do this one more time. Hold on one second. Okay, Ed, I'll be right back to you. Ed's got a question. Let me share my screen again. I just want to show you the cover picture here. Let me end that. Okay, we'll go back to the beginning here. I should have spent a little more time on that. Let's see. From beginning. Okay, so that's the Sully portrait right there, that you see. And what you notice about it, he's got a giraffe neck in this portrait. Okay? His neck is really long. Andalusia, which I told you about earlier. That's the house of Nicholas Biddle, where Roswell spent a lot of time there. Roswell actually went there after Nicholas's death to advise Nicholas's son about running Nicholas's grapery that's still there to this day, a brick grapery that still exists. Roswell was there to help him with that. There's a portrait of a guy called John Glenn. It's not the astronaut. It's John Glenn of Baltimore from the 1840s. His portrait done by Sully also has the neck like that, has this sort of very tall neck, the giraffe neck, we call it. What's important about this portrait is that one of the descendants, who now lives in California, of Roswell, donated this portrait to the Passaic County Historical Society. His last name is Reed, is Colt as well. He's involved in the medical industry, and he was nice enough, because he felt it would be an appropriate home in Paterson, where that portrait did live for a long time, that the family actually donated it to us, to the Historical Society. So I just want to point that out. All right. So let me stop sharing screen again. I should have started off with that. All right. So there's a question in the box from Ed Marcus. Did you go to school 20? My father owned 105 River Street, purchasing the SUM on a deed. Grandfather owned 2 steel mills in 1900. So Ed, I didn't go to school 20, but who did was my father. So Gordon L. Corbett Jr., who actually passed away back in 1981. He was a New Jersey, he was a record photographer for many years, a Patersonian. My grandmother actually taught. My grandmother was a school teacher at School 20. She was an art teacher who actually, Marty Filowitz, who's on the call tonight, was one of her students, basically. So, and so, yeah, he would have, if you have the SUM documents, those are fairly rare. Because the actual documents are much bigger than the notations in the book and the SUM record books, which some of those still exist both in the Paterson Museum and at the Passaic County Historical Society. So what you have is a much larger one, probably with a seal on it, Roswell's signature on it and stuff. That's the way they sold off pieces of property to various people, basically. And so what would be interesting about it, if it was in River Street, would have been that area around Bridge Street where Roswell had a farm there and stuff. So what year did thank you, Peggy. What year did the Colt Mansion burn down? Well, it burned several times, actually. The worst fire of all was the one in the early 80s, when an arsonist went through that whole ATP complex and set fires, and that was the worst of all of them. But over the years, the factory first lost the roof, and they rebuilt it. They took off a floor, and had other fires over the years, not as bad, but that one in the early 1980s is the one that pretty much destroyed the building. My understanding through the Park Service is that that the building which remaining will be stabilized, and that site will become accessible at some point. They've done some archaeological work there already. Several years ago, I was fortunate to be able to go when they were digging up the tail race that led out to Mill Street. We found the actual behind the mill, where I just showed you before, the nail mill, where that raceway would have been located. There was a trough basically at the end of that, made of wood, and they found the remnants of that when they dug that area up. The other problem, of course, with the site is that it's a brownfield there, and it's going to take some time to stabilize. Now, those of you who haven't been there yet, they have the brand new quarry field, which is a wonderful. It's remarkable. For all of us knew what that looked like before. Sort of, if you go down the driveway toward up in the parking lot, Mary Kramer Park, down to the river level and stuff, you go down that driveway. Off to the right, it was always like vegetation and whatever, ruins. Well, they've cleared a lot of that out, and now it's a park in there, and they're stabilizing a lot of the walls there. And so what will eventually happen, this is my personal advocacy work I'm going to try to do, is to make the gun mill the place where we can have visitors understand how water works in a system like that. That's my personal bucket list, to try to make that happen. I hope we can do that. I hope I can advocate for that and find the money to do it. But that seems to be the best place to do it too, if we get a water wheel. And actually, in the records, Roswell's records in Pennsylvania, I found the bill from Mr. Van Winkle to build the water wheel for the Colt gun mill. I found a lot of those things in there. So we know more about it. And I hope that, even if they just simply stabilize what's there, it's left, the walls, they can still build a replica of the water supply into the mill. It drops from the up, of course, in the backside, the middle raceway, it drops down into the mill, turns the wheel, and then out to Mill Street it goes. That would be a wonderful thing if we could do that. I'm hoping we can, and it's done in Lowell, not really well, I don't think, because they didn't have a good site to do it. But that's my hope. The raceway is going to take a while to redo because there's so many complications to it. And those complications go back to the 1700s when they were losing water out of the canal to begin with then. Well, we still lose water out of the canal now. And so it's going to be that and just dealing with all the points of departure for the water into the mills and into other sewers and everything else to try to get it back into shape again. So maybe one day. James has got another question. Is there any guide walking towards the raceways? Yes, the Park Service runs. Of course, during the winter, I think there are still some tours going on, but you could, in fact, contact them. I think I saw something online the other day if you were interested in going on a tour. So you could do that. Let's see. What do we got last? I got last couple of questions here. Okay. This is Marty Filowitz, and is one of our board members. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't mention earlier, Marty's recent board member, student of Ruth Corbett, my grandmother, who purchased the Colt estate, and when was it torn down? Well, the sad tale of the Roswell house was the fact that when Roswell dies in 1856, it basically goes through a series of family members who become the governor of the SUM. And its desirability to live there starts to trail off. Now, in today's world, it would have been an incredible historical resource for Paterson. But it ends up that the SUM effectively sells the property off because the Colt family actually does, because Roswell ended up buying it from the SUM. So the Colt family actually sells it off, and it gets chopped up into little pieces. What's interesting about the sale of it was the fact that all that sand, that was another sandy hill, what that was on. You would never know that existed looking at the area today. But they had to literally take all the sand and other materials out of there, including the stones from the house. And I found an article that I still have not gone to this house yet. I've identified where it is in Lakeview on the Clifton border. There was a house built using Roswell's stone as sandstone walls, because all of that material that came from the house was dumped into what was called the lake, which is now Lakeview Avenue in Clifton. That's where it all ended up. It was fill for that. And so apparently a mason, I found an article where a mason dug up some of that and used in a foundation wall of a house on, I can't remember the name of the street right now, but Wabash Avenue. That's where it is, Wabash Avenue. So anyway, so it was sold off piece by piece, but guess who bought up a lot of it? As you know, the front side of it, if you want to call it that, let's call it the site pointed toward the river. That side of it was all developed into commercial properties along Main Street, as you know. The church, the Catholic Church, was eventually built in the corner there, Grand. So that whole side of it became mostly commercial. The rest of it, the majority of it, in the middle became the courthouse and the post office, the old post office, and other buildings. And then the piece closest to the railroad, some of that became commercial as well, as you know. So basically the top of the hill is where the courthouse is today. So that's what's there now. So it's sad that we don't have it anymore. There's a lot of sad tales in Paterson. This is another one of them. But anyway, so Charon Breaks, is the Biddle person related to the Biddle Duke name? I would almost bet you it is. The Biddles were it was a major Philadelphia family. Nicholas Biddle was just one of many, but he was famous. His brother was a Commodore in the Navy and was involved in, all the issues of the Navy being in the Middle East in the early 1800s, and some interesting stories there. Andalusia does a really good job of telling that story of the different Biddles, but it's Nicholas Biddle, Roswell's friend, is the one who built the the mansion on the Delaware River. And so if you go there, you'll know that Roswell walked where you walk, because that was, again, it was a friend. Uh, so I think that's it for tonight. So I want to thank you for your wonderful comments there. Thank you for the correction, JD, on the statues. Yes. And like I said, one day, I hope to have a biography. It won't be in the near future. I've got, unfortunately, other book projects right now, but it's been a fun thing. It's been fun talking to you about it tonight. One last point. So please keep us in mind. If you're looking to help, that donation link is in the chat box. If you're interested in more webinars, most of them right now are being publicized on Facebook. If you want, like I said, if you signed up for this one tonight, you'll be put on our mailing list. So we've got other future ones coming up. Heather Garside, the curator of the Paterson Museum's got one coming up. I think this next one will be on Jenny Tuttle Hobart, the president's wife, and a lot of other interesting ones right through May. So we hope you enjoy these. We've had fun putting them together. Ed Smike's got a few more. He's going to be doing one on the Meadowbrook is probably the next one. So again, I think we're in good shape tonight. So with that note, way past time. It's 8:45 already. I want to thank you all for coming, and take care.